Hello, and welcome to Commendable Commotion, where the arts and true crime intersect. Today, I'll be talking to Robin Ramsay, who runs a very interesting publication called Lobster. Since 1983, Lobster has featured articles delving into all sorts of mysterious parapolitical subject matter. In the late 1980s, Robin gained national attention in the UK when Lobster's team became involved in a very intriguing story relating to the intelligence services, which you will hear him talk about in our interview today. During that time, Robin appeared on the prestigious talk show After Dark for a round-table discussion on national security. A link to that programme will be in the description of this podcast, but today, years on from his memorable television appearance, Robin will tell me a bit about what the term parapolitical actually means, and he'll talk also about how he got into investigative journalism in the first place. And, of course, he'll give some excellent advice for aspiring journalists and writers along the way. So, sit back and enjoy our conversation. The first thing that I'd like to ask you, and it'll be interesting, how did you get into journalism? How did you get interested in journalism and writing?
Well, writing, I was a student in the early 70s, an undergraduate. And I guess I got interested in the idea of being a writer had always been around in the back of my head, but I'd never done any. So I went to university and left university and began doing little bits and pieces and had the basic experience that I'd write something, get up the next day, I'd think it was crap and throw it away. And then one day I wrote something, got up the next day and thought, that's not bad. And I thought, perhaps I can do this after all. And I actually began in 1976, I think it was. It's a long time ago. A long conspiracy theory was published by a magazine called the International Times, which the International Times was the last hangover of the underground press in England in the 60s rather. And it staggered on to 1977. And they ran this long conspiracy theory as a kind of comic. It was called The Skeleton Key to the Gemstone File. You can find it on the internet. It's now on the internet. And I read this and thought, wow, it was all about Kennedy and post-war American history. And I thought, wonder what this is about. So I went back to the university library to check it. The rest of my buddies, who were all sitting smoking, not going, oh, far out, man. I went, far out, man. I wonder if it's true. And went to the university library. And I ended up in American history, which I'd never been, a floor in the library I'd never been on. And I began checking this conspiracy theories claims one by one, and they were all nonsense, right? So I began in this field disproving a conspiracy theory, falsifying a conspiracy theory. And eventually I wrote a refutation of this and sent it off to International Times, and they published it. And that's how I got started.
Very good.
Then I went to the university library for about 5 years. I was standing on the door, unemployed, standing on the door. I went to the university library every day for about 5 years and educated myself properly, as opposed to doing the degree I had done. I self-educated and have acquired a big pile of knowledge, which I began to use in the early 80s.
I see. Okay, that's interesting. So, it shows the importance of being objective when you're researching a particular topic. You didn't just kind of run with what you read. You actually sort of, gave your side of the perspective. Okay, that's good.
Oh, no. I took on board entirely internalized the rationality and appropriateness of academic thinking and writing. If you're going to make a claim, show the evidence. This is why Lobster's up to here in footnotes. You're going to have to show the evidence. And I was greatly influenced by a man called Peter Dale Scott, an American, who wrote about the Kennedy assassination. And he was an academic, and he produced these beautiful academic massively footnoted articles and books. And I thought that's the way to do it, which is what I did.
Very good. That's interesting. So in terms of then, when you start moving into publishing Lobster, from that time forward, I believe Lobster started in 1983. Is that right?
83. Yeah.
How did that come about? What made you decide to do that?
Well, it came about because there was a guy in Northern Ireland called Harry Irwin. I think he's dead now. He must be dead now. And he was a Kennedy buff. And by reading in the library, I had sort of drifted into the Kennedy stuff. And I can't remember how I heard about Harry. And I wrote to Harry, and Harry put me in touch with this other guy in England that he knew who was a Kennedy buff. And he lived in Huddersfield. That was Stephen Dorrell. So Stephen Dorrell and I began corresponding. And he had already self-published a little pamphlet about the fascists in Huddersfield. And I'd written a little pamphlet about basically about parapolitics. And I was then working on a local radical magazine. So we knew about publication. We knew how to do it. We knew how to, because in those days, before computers, it was, type, cut it up, stick it down, get it straight, all that stuff. Paste up, old-fashioned. I mean, I've still got my T-square hanging on the wall. And so we met and decided to do a little magazine. I've got a copy of the first issue somewhere. Nah, I can't see it. Anyway, we published a little magazine, an A5, this size. 150 copies. And for some reason, I have no idea how, I can't remember how we distributed it, who got it, but a few people bought it. So we did another one, and it grew very, very slowly. And at its maximum, it was selling 1,000 copies.
And the term that you mentioned just earlier, parapolitics and, parapolitical, for people unfamiliar with that term, because sometimes it doesn't seem to be a term that's used that often, which is kind of surprising.
It's not used much anymore. It was Peter Dale Scott's term. Peter Dale Scott invented it in the early 70s somewhere. And, I would now be hard pushed to find parapolitics. Essentially, he was interested in, what would you describe it as? He was essentially interested in the hidden world. He took that, what you saw through the mass media of politics was essentially one version of it, but behind it was all the other stuff. Of course, in America, you had these huge federal bureaucracies, the FBI, the NSA, the CIA, et cetera, all of which, none of which hardly any of which got reported. And they had enormous power and enormous money. And he was interested in how that interacted with formal party politics, I guess. And so I thought, yes, that's probably true in Britain. We've got MI5, MI6, And in the late 1970s, there was hardly anybody doing this. Duncan Campbell was doing a bit at the New Statesman. I think that was about it. There was a bit in Time Out magazine. And that was it, really. So we just drifted into it. And it never occurred to me I'd still be doing it 40 years later, which is an absurdity. I've spent most of my life doing this.
Well, because it's such a term that isn't used quite often, I know obviously you've touched on what it means before, but just briefly for people unfamiliar with the term, how would you sum it up concisely? Parapolitics.
Parapolitics. The interaction between the secret agencies of the state and civil society and politics, basically. That, I'm sure that's not what Peter Dale Scott said in 1972, and I could Google that if you were interested, but I can't actually remember what Peter Dale Scott said. And I agree, it's not a term that's used much in Britain. It never caught on here. And I noticed Donald Trump started using it once or twice, which rather put me off it as well.
Right. I didn't know that. That's interesting. I didn't know that. In terms of sort of particular topics that, back when you started Lobster that you were particularly interested in, and now as well, what particular elements of the whole kind of parapolitical realm would particularly interest you? Are you equally interested in all the different aspects of it? What do you think?
Well, as you can see, we began with an interest in the Kennedy assassination. That's the one thing we had in common. And we were interested in Northern Ireland and MI5 and MI6. Of course, in 1982, when we met, there was hardly anything on any of this. I mean, Kennedy assassination, yes, but on British stuff, there was nothing. Little snippets in newspapers. I mean, we were cutting up papers every day, filing it away. I've got four filing cabinets in this room, full of bits of paper, hardly any of which I ever use anymore. But that's what it used to be, filing cabinets. No, sure, I'll show you them.
Sure. Wow.
Filing cabinet.
Yeah, it's a good collection. Yeah,
it's a room full of books that I don't read anymore, and filing cabinets that I don't read anymore, because these days anything you could want is online. It is literally the case that the day I went online was the last day I went to the University of Hull Library. I haven't been back since.
What year was that?
When did I go online? I can't remember. 96, 7, something like that.
Yeah,
a long time.
The internet's really kind of democratized information and really made so many things available. But still, sometimes,
Sure.
would you agree that maybe sometimes like there's some things that you just can't find on the internet, obviously, and you really need to, go the extra mile? That no.
I have not done any research in a library since I went online. I can't think of an occasion when I had to do it. If I can't find it online, I have to do something else and come back to it and maybe try it from another angle, maybe find it there. There's almost nothing. Some very old stuff's not online, clearly, but there's almost nothing now that you can't find. It is a very strange world that we're living in that sense. I mean, this is Internet 1. Internet 1 was a giant encyclopedia, which suddenly had all this information at your fingertips. Internet 2 and Internet 3 is just, I don't know who coined the phrase, weapons of mass distraction,
The That's a good term. I never heard that one before, surprisingly.
You have to Google it. I can't remember who said it, but that's what it is.
Yeah.
And selling you stupid shit. People buying stuff, shopping and entertainment,
Yeah. The so you particularly mentioned interested in the JFK assassination, for
Sure.
example. What drew you to that particular? Well, I mean, I know obviously beyond the fact that a president was assassinated, was there anything particular that drew you to it?
I mean, it's difficult to know why why do subjects appeal to some people, not to others? I don't know why the Kennedy assassination appealed to me. I mean, I could be semi-serious and say, well, at the time I was deeply involved in an Oedipal relationship with my mother and father. Their marriage had broken up, blah, blah, blah. So maybe there was something about killing daddy. Who knows? To me, it just suddenly struck me, wow, this is interesting. How come nobody knows about this? Because as soon as you look at it, it's immediately obvious the official story is nonsense. And this is a big event. This is the head of the most powerful nation in the world at the time. I mean, America dominated the world in 1963, like it hasn't done since, really. And suddenly he gets bumped off in public, and no one bothers. So this is very, very striking. It's just a very striking event. It's not, the question isn't really why am I interested in it. The question really is, why is everybody else not interested in it? How can they let this? I mean, the American political system and the American media just let it slide by. Oh well, nobody wants to look at it. Very, very odd. Very, very striking too.
Did you uncover or research very sort of niche aspects of it that were overlooked?
No, I'm a generalist. I mean, I'm a journalist. I want to see the big pictures. So I'm not the guy to ask about the nature of the bullet. How many turns on, that sort of stuff. There are people like that. They're on the internet, a few hundred of them, doing extraordinarily minute research. I mean, preposterous research. I mean, I don't care. I don't care how big the stain was on the presidential limousine floor. Some people do. I mean, I'm not going to put them down for it, but to me, it's not of any interest. I want to know who did it. In fact, the Kennedy assassination world has long since abandoned who did it, because people study these things, and people study a subject, they specialize, and what they're looking at gets narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower. Their knowledge gets deeper and deeper, but the field shrinks. So you got all these. So JFK world is now lots of little specialists who specialize in the bullets, the rifle, the cover-up, Tippit, Jack Ruby. You know what I mean? Bits and pieces. Nobody's actually asking, well, who did it? People really don't ask that question anymore. They're long since past that. They don't think they'll ever solve it. I personally think it's been solved pretty much, but I'm a minority, and the Kennedy assassination buffs ignore me. They take no notice of me.
And so what's your kind of idea of then who did it and how was it solved, or who was it?
Well, I mean, this has taken me 40 years to get here, and what you've got is series. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, in a sense. I think what actually happened is, I've written this in Lobster fairly recently. My view of what actually happened is the following. The anti-Castro division of the CIA. Kennedy was making peace with Castro on the quiet. He was making peace with Khrushchev on the quiet as well. Kennedy was trying to end the Cold War. Kennedy and Khrushchev wanted to end the Cold War, but they had to do it with large military forces behind them. They both had huge military establishments, and which were making money and careers and all the rest of it on the Cold War. So they were doing it clandestinely. Kennedy was putting out feelers to Castro, and the CIA's Cuban division decided that they would block this. And they would block this by organizing a phony assassination attempt. They would get somebody who was publicly identified as very, very pro-Castro, Lee Harvey Oswald, one of their agents, running around, hands off Cuba. It was all the front. They would get him, set him up as a pro-Castro figure, and then get him to fire a rifle at Kennedy. And the original plan was he would fire a rifle and he wasn't trying to kill him, just fire a shot. Then they would arrest him and he would die in the arrest. Suddenly you would have pro-Castro activist fires at Kennedy, and that would give the CIA a chance to kibosh Kennedy's peace feelers to Castro. What then happened was, and this is the bit where the evidence is slight, that elsewhere in the CIA, the news got out that this phony stunt was being attempted, and people realized, we can do a real assassination attempt on top of the phony one, and it'll all be covered up because the CIA won't want the phony one revealed. So it was piggybacked. Essentially, it was piggybacked. Now, looking back on it, I wrote about this in 1984 and completely forgot about it. I was reading a version of the piggyback theory about 3 years ago and thought, this is oddly familiar. And then I remember that I'd written it myself in 1984 and just forgotten about it. Lobster's now 5 million words or something. So 5 million words later, I'd simply forgotten that I'd written it. So I solved it in a sense in 1984, but I just forgot about it. So what's what you had? A real assassination attempt was piggybacked on a phony. So and the whole thing was covered up by the people who had to cover up the phony. So the CIA covered it all up. They had to because they were running this little stunt, a little stunt. There's some decent evidence about the stunt. There's not much about the real assassination attempt because everybody's dead.
I see. That's the difficulty when researching, topics from the 20th century and, even sometimes late 20th century on occasion. But so, speaking of the JFK assassination, you said well, how come other people weren't interested in what really happened, that kind of thing. What it kind of reminds me of just tangentially is the whole sort of strategy of tension that you may have written about in Italy in the 70s. Did you write about that in Lobster at some point?
I have written about a strategy of tension. I've published bits and pieces about it. I've written about the strategy of tension in Britain in the late 1970s. There was one here too. It's in Lobster 81, if anybody wants to look at it. I saw a couple during lockdown, a guy got in touch with me. I live in Hull. He lived in Scarborough, which is 40 miles away. We used to meet halfway because he refused to use a keyboard. He wouldn't text me. He refused or email me. We had to do it in person. And he was part of what was essentially a strategy of tension in Britain, which climaxed with the shooting of a policeman in Leeds in 1981, was it? During the miners' strike. The plan was they shot this policeman and they were going to blame two of the striking miners. But the shooting went ahead, the guy was killed, but the bit about framing the miners went wrong because the assassin got cold feet about doing the second part. And then he was killed. And this guy who got in touch with me, he was framed and put in prison for 8 years. A bit like Colin Wallace. In this country, if you do something really, which the state really doesn't like, they don't kill you. They cancel you, they fuck up your pension, or they put you in prison. I mean, Colin Wallace was framed for murder. This guy, Peter Sanderson, was framed for bank robberies he hadn't committed, and he served 8 years. Because, like Wallace, neither of them would admit it. They were offered him parole. He would to get parole, you have to admit you did it. He refused to admit he did it. So he stayed in prison for 3 years longer than he had to because he wouldn't admit it. So anyway, yes, there was a strategy of tension in Britain and it climaxed and fizzled out during the miners' strike. But it was a very modest British kind of thing. They weren't going to shoot lots of people or blow a big bomb up, like in what was it, Verona Station? What was the station that they blew
Bologna.
up in Italy? Bologna. They blew up the Bologna station, killed 86 people or something.
Yeah.
Here they were just going to kill one guy, a modest British version, but with the same idea to smear the left. Absolutely idiotic. I mean, the miners' strike was doomed to failure. I knew it would fail as soon as it began. They didn't have the support of the Labour movement because they hadn't had a ballot. They hadn't gone through the procedure. The Labour movement in Britain is proceduralist. If you don't do the procedures, you don't get our support. So the miners were doomed to failure. There was no need for them, to run a strategy of tension against the miners. They were doomed. They were going to lose. Idiotic. Anyway, it's Lobster 81.
Lobster 81. That's really interesting because I actually, for some reason, was not terribly familiar with the idea of a British strategy of tension. I'm surprised I haven't read about that.
Well, go back to the 70s. You had in 1973, you had a faction of MI5, which was getting information from the CIA was telling the Conservative Party and the Daily Telegraph, for example, the right wing of the British political, they was telling them that the Russians control the Communist Party in Britain, the Communist Party control the trade unions, and the trade unions control the Labour Party. So the Soviets control the Labour Party. That was the theory. The Telegraph published this. The Daily Telegraph ran this. And a section of people on the right wing of the army, bits of the intelligence services, and in the Conservative Party believed this stuff. And they began a whole series of things like the so-called private armies episode. Sir Walter Walker, excuse me a second, I'm talking, I'm getting dry.
Yeah, no problem.
There's the private episode. Walter Walker set up a thing called civil assistance, which was a kind of militia, a countrywide militia. David Sterling, who was the SAS Waller, who was a big hero in World War II, he set up a thing called Unison. Was it him who set up Unison? Or was that Walter Walker? Even I'm forgetting the details now. So all this stuff, they're machinating. Everybody's preparing for the great confrontation with the Soviet forces who are running the trade unions. This is an astounding delusion. I mean, yes, the Communist Party of Great Britain had quite heavily influence in half a dozen of the British trade unions. They did. They had delegates on the central committees. It's all been documented. But the idea that they could control the trade union movements was a fantastic delusion. The idea that the British Communist Party wanted a revolution was a fantastic delusion. I mean, I knew these people. My parents had been in the Communist Party. These people weren't revolutionaries. Extraordinary nonsense. And this is all, it's like a large chunk of America on the right believes that the last election was stolen, that Trump was the real president. There's no evidence for this at all, but they believe it anyway. And it's a delusion. And the idea that the British left was on the verge of seizing control of British society and having a revolution in 1974 was an extraordinary delusion. Nonetheless, these people believed it. And they began bugging all the Labour government. When the Labour government took over in 74, they began tapping all the phones, going through the dustbins. They were going through Tony Benn's rubbish every week, looking for incriminating evidence that Ben was, this fantastic nonsense. Fantastic nonsense.
Yeah, you could easily make sounds like you could easily make a sort of comedy out of it or a sitcom or something, I guess,
It's looking back on it, it is comic. At the time, it was serious because the British economy, when Labour took over in 1974, inflation was 20% and rising, thanks to Mr. Heath. This is a big problem. 25% inflation is a big problem.
Yeah.
Unemployment was rising. So yeah, it looks like it. I mean, it's really funny. It's now looked back. The mid-70s is looked upon as a great crisis in British political life. In a sense, it was. But the surveys show the British have never been happier than they were in 1976. And also Britain was never less unequal. Britain was at its most equal in terms of income distribution in 1976, and the British were also at their happiest in 1976. But if you listen to the right wing of the British media and the Tory party, we were on the verge of a socialist revolution. Incredible nonsense. And they were fighting. I mean, they were talking about coups. Harold Wilson, was talking about them running a coup against them. And there was talk of coups. There was. How serious it was, who knows? And when I worked briefly for Channel 4 News trying to research all this stuff on the Colin Walker story, I rang some of these guys up, the generals, and of course they won't say anything. Nobody will talk. In this country, nobody talks. They just won't tell you. So you don't know. And then there's no any evidence. There's no evidence about any of this. The only evidence, first time we've got, is people like Wallace and this new guy, Peter Sanderson in Scarborough, who talked about the later 70s and the 80s. He talked, and Wallace talked, and Fred Holroyd talked about Northern Ireland. But apart, there's a handful of whistleblowers otherwise, and the media just basically ignore it. Because
go on. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
I was just wondering, so in terms of, Colin Wallace, did you feel, so I mean, for those unfamiliar, Colin Wallace, former, I believe, military intelligence, was he? He was officially a press officer in Northern Ireland in the 70s. And when he was recruited, he worked as a PSYOPs officer, psychological operations. Essentially, he was the guy on the ground who he directed all their psychological operations against the IRA chiefly, and I mean INLA eventually, but the IRA. So he was the man on the ground working for what was his bit of the army called? It wasn't called PSYOPs. It had another name. Information policy. He worked for information policy, and they were telling lies. They were planting lies in newspapers and stuff like that, and producing forgeries. I've got some of the forgeries in my filing cabinet.
pamphlets apparently showing Labour MPs at pro-IRA meetings, that sort of thing, just the usual nonsense. Wallace came out and told everybody, and the only person that took him seriously was me. I mean, none of the major media would deal with him. They wouldn't take it. They wouldn't believe it.
When you were working on the Colin Wallace story, did you ever feel a bit intimidated by anything or anyone, or was it just relatively easy?
I lived in Hull in those days in relative poverty with no money. I could afford a phone bill. No, I never got threatened. I never got any nasty phone calls. I assume my phone was tapped. I don't know if it was or not. You just assume it is. I assume everything. I now think everything that I keyboard on the computer is going to be public. The internet is public. Dominic Cummings doesn't seem to understand this, does he? If you keyboard it, mate, somebody's going to find it. So somehow I knew that from the very first day. So no, it was just like, here's this fantastic story, and why won't the media deal with it? So there's quite a funny. Steve Dorrell and I began working on the Wallace story. I went to see Colin, and we had lots and lots of exchanges because he was sending us stuff when he was in prison before he came out. We were getting so it had this huge pile of paper. So I went to see Colin, met Fred, met their wives. And so we wrote this, and then we started writing this document. It was called Lobster. It was Lobster 11 about Colin Wallace. And in the middle of that, or at the beginning of that, Steve Dorrell was offered a big check to go and write a book with Anthony Summers. Here's 20 grand. Come and write a book with me. So Steve Dorrell, who had, like me, had no money, said, yeah, okay, fine. So I ended up writing the Wallace story. And it was 50 pages. So we published a 50-page, A4 50 pages, and gave it to the British media, and thinking they would read it. And of course, how little we knew. We had a press conference, gave this stuff out. There was some journalist there, handed it out. 50 pages, they went, and threw it away. Didn't read it. Nobody took any notice. Nothing happened. The biggest story in our view, I think we called it the British Watergate. Yeah, we did. The British Watergate. Nobody took any notice. And then Peter Wright came along in Australia, began talking about MI5 plotting against Harold Wilson. And these journalists all went, oh, that's interesting. Those guys from up north said something like this. And they all fished in their bins and fished out Lobster 11. And I began getting hundreds of phone calls. I spent 3 years explaining Colin Wallace to the major media. Just all the time, constantly. Because they rang me up and I would explain to them. They'd say they're having to do the work. It's a very complicated story.
It is definitely. And reading Paul Foot's book, Framing Colin Wallace, which is an excellent book, but big book as well. Like it's a complex story, a lot of history, but it's interesting. And so, in terms of you ended up on the show After Dark, is that right?
I did After Dark. Yeah, I can't remember when that was. 80. I have no idea. It's online apparently. I'd have no desire to see myself again. I have no desire to watch this interview again either. Trust me.
So it's 3 hours. It's all on YouTube. 3 hours.
It's all on YouTube somewhere. Yeah, 3 hours. It was amusing at the time, but it was television is a way. Television is not an information medium. Television is an entertainment medium. People say to me, "Oh, look, watch this thing on YouTube." I will say the same thing. Listen, if I can't read it, copy it, paste it, save it, I'm not interested in the information. It's not usable. There's no point in saying, watch this YouTube video, go to 18 minutes and 46 seconds. Yeah, okay. But then I've got to write down what they said at 18 minutes and 46 seconds. I want print. I want print that I can lift and use and reassemble. That's what I do.
Have you ever been interested in maybe, say, video editing, like editing segments so you can put together a nice little piece? And no?
No. I haven't got the knowledge, and at my age it would take me a long time to acquire, because I'm 75 and you don't learn things quickly at this age, alas. And no, it never interested me, and I have no desire to put a video on YouTube. And even if it got 1 million views, I'd rather write a decent 500 words, a literate 500 words, properly documented. That's what I do. I write, assemble, edit, proofread. I don't want to make videos now. It doesn't interest me. You can't do this stuff on film. Not really. You can show Colin Wallace. There's a decent video on Colin Wallace on YouTube called, I forgot what it's called. I appear in it briefly, rambling away as usual, like this, same rambling nonsense. But it's quite a nice video. But I'd rather read, I'd rather read it than watch it, which
Sure.
is just my age and where I came from.
Yeah.
Young people under 30 wouldn't think like this, most of them anyway.
I know what you mean. I know what you mean. It's interesting. I mean, certainly it's been around for a long time, the whole art of writing. And, before we touch on that briefly about kind of the art of writing, what exactly, like when you heard, I mean, again, maybe difficult to remember. And I know you mentioned like, it was amusing, that kind of thing for you, but were you excited like at all when you heard you were going to be on this like, quite well-known talk show after dark, like, with political figures and, intelligence officers and former intelligence officers? No? Were you not
One
excited?
former intelligence officer, was I excited? I can't remember. I think I'd been on TV already. I think I'd been interviewed by various odds and ends beforehand, so it wasn't that big a deal. It was quite an interesting experience. So yeah, it was quite interesting. But that's all I would say. And I came back and for about, it had one interesting side effect. I was then in the Labour Party, and nobody in my local branch took any notice of what I did at all. But then for about 6 months after I'd been on television, they began listening to me. And it wore off quite quickly. But for about 6 months, they thought, he must be serious that he's on television.
That's the strange power of television, and then sometimes it can just wear
Well,
off.
in those days, there were only 5 channels, weren't there? Yeah, 5, or may have only been 4. And Sky, of course, but on the non-paying, I think there were only 5 channels. So after that was probably watched by about 1 million people, which is a lot of people.
Yeah.
I mean, most would be half pissed, of course, at midnight on a Friday night, back from the pub. What are we going to do? Get a curry and put the telly on. What we got after dark? Oh.
Well, I mean, that's it's strange because the stuff they talked about on that show was pretty serious, like, but it was amusing in a good way. Like, I mean, it was it was informal environment, but the stuff they were talking about was pretty serious. Like, I mean, sometimes, I mean,
You've watched? I haven't watched it. I don't remember I don't remember what was on it. Oh, I remember getting the last word in. I remember the guy tried to end it, and right at the end I said, "Hang on a minute," and I summarised and I said, "The cover-up's in place. There won't be. Nothing's going to happen." And I was wrong. Wallace eventually got his name cleared. He was acquitted, had his charges dismissed, and all the rest of it. And he won. And he did that largely, I suspect, he succeeded largely because of Tam Dalyell. Tam Dalyell MP was a friend of Michael Quinlan. Michael Quinlan was the #1 civil service in the MOD. I think they played squash together. And Tam Dalyell kept nagging him, "Why are you persecuting Wallace? Why don't you, why? And eventually they gave in. They gave in. Why bother? And they gave up. And it was so long ago, it didn't matter. That's the point in Britain. That's what happens in Britain. I mean, the stuff about the murder of Sergeant Speed in Leeds in 1982. 82? Yes, it was 82. Eventually, when that's far enough away, probably quite soon, they'll tell the truth. When it has no impact politically. Now, by the time Wallace was acquitted in the 90s, it was so long ago, nobody cared. It didn't matter. Nobody's career was at stake. Nobody was going to lose, their promotion because they'd fucked it up in the 70s. It didn't matter anymore. They were all well retired now. And that's how it works in Britain. You won't get anything done now. I mean, it's like COVID. Nothing will happen on COVID, but 30 years' time, maybe something will happen.
Interesting. So, in terms of like, on a on a slightly lighter note, kind of writing and journalism, you prefer print to video, as you mentioned. Would you say that there's a good kind of blend that you can have of, say, the arts, broadly speaking, which, very broad term, but it can refer to writing and, journalism, and creative writing, and you can blend it with essentially true crime. So the arts and true crime and all related things, which, they can blend quite well in investigative journalism. Because this podcast is sort of about, the blending of true crime and the arts, that's commendable commotion in general. So what's your thoughts on that idea of like the blending of, like, broadly speaking, the arts and writing and creative journalism, and then true crime, which some people look at in a very scientific, very sort of technical way sometimes, but not always. In fact, most of the time, maybe not. But what are your thoughts on blending those two?
Well, I'm not sure that I have any thoughts. My problem is I I have got upstairs. There's a room upstairs full of books. So I've got 1,000 crime novels, probably. They're almost virtually all American. I've been obsessively reading American crime novels since the late 70s, and I've read virtually everybody. And I love American crime, and we're living through the golden age of American crime writing, and British crime writing for that matter too. My local charity shop is full of crime novels. Everybody's reading and buying crime novels, but true crime doesn't interest me at all. Political crime interests me, but true crime like murders, I don't care. I'm not interested. It doesn't ring my bell at all. It's essentially it's small scale piffle. You know, somebody gets killed. It's a big deal for friends, family, and neighbors. But for the rest of us, you know, they could have been run over by a bus. Who would care? So no, true crime doesn't interest me. So I don't. If this was the point of having me on to talk about true crime, I really don't have any ideas at all.
Oh, no, don't worry. No, I only meant just that it's sometimes interesting how with maybe studies of, intelligence agencies, things like that, and parapolitical studies, often you get, what can be criminal stories and any sort of tangential.
Oh yeah, massive criminal stories, huge, elaborate criminal stories, sure. Or parapolitics, most parapolitics is based on illegality at one level or another. You know, just from the boring stuff like tabbing people's phones, breaking in and stealing things and all the rest of it, right through to, bumping people off. You sure? Parapolitics is about state crime. That's the point. I'm interested in the behavior of states and I guess corporations, but basically states, because in theory, we live in a democracy and this shouldn't be happening. That's the central problem of Britain. This stuff does happen and the politicians don't want to know about it. They're not interested. And they're not interested because it's too complicated. I can remember trying to get the light off my glasses. Doesn't matter. For example, when we had all the stuff about Wallace and about the Labour Party and Harold Wilson and this operation and that operation, we had a huge pile of stuff, which I kept pushing it towards the Labour Party leadership. I was a member of the Labour Party. I assumed, in my innocence, they'd be interested. Nobody wanted to know. You know why? Too complicated. They're too busy. They've got too much to read, and and it's dangerous because you might irritate MI5, and who knows what MI5 would do to you? You could kill your career. You could. So the only person that ever took it, there were three that took it semi-seriously. One was Ken Livingstone, and the other was Tam Dial, and the third was what's his name? I've forgotten the third guy's name. Donald, Duncan. Anyway, there were three of them took it semi-seriously and would ask questions in the comments. But for example, Ken Livingstone asked a lot of questions in the comments in 88, 89, but the questions were actually being asked by his researcher, a man called Neil Grant. And Neil Grant was a school teacher, but also working for Ken. And Colin Wallace and I would feed Neil Grant material, and Ken would write questions and ask the comments. The questions were mostly ignored or given very bland responses. Then Neil Grant quit, and of course Ken never asked another question. He wasn't doing it. Neil Grant was doing it. And Tam Dial was an eccentric. I mean, a seriously eccentric guy. So you could never rely on Tam Dial doing anything he didn't want to do. It's a nice story. I met Tam Dial for the first time in House of Commons. I meet Tam. Hello, Robin. This is Robin Ramsay. Hello, Tam Dial. How'd you? Nice to meet you. And he put his hand in his pocket and he pulled out a handful of really tired-looking lettuce and said, "Would you like some lettuce?" And I went, "Oh, no, thanks, Tam." But you think, what? Who are these people? Lettuce? Who carries lettuce in a pocket? For one thing, who puts lettuce in your pocket?
That's
And you had some. Would you offer it to a stranger?
Sounds like eccentricity of the highest order.
Eccentricity of the highest. Someday I was an eccentric of the highest order.
But here's the thing: how would you for aspiring writers, aspiring journalists who are interested in writing about power politics, researching power politics, even just explaining power politics in another medium such as film, which I know you may be less fond of, I understand. How would you, or let's say sticking it, or keeping to the idea of writing, keeping it in print and writing about power politics, what would you recommend to people who want to do that to try and make it as least complex as possible, explaining these complex concepts to the public? Like, how would you recommend doing that?
Well, you won't explain it to the public. the public will never get this. They will never be interested in this. It doesn't. People aren't interested in politics. People don't care about politics. Most people I know don't care about politics. So forget the public. I remember years and years and years ago, I got rung up by a guy in Glasgow. This is back in the 90s, I think. And he rang me up and he said, we wanted to talk about setting up a radical magazine in Glasgow. What should he do? I said, well, look, what you've got to do is produce something that you would like to read and forget the public. Why? He said. I said, because the public will never read it. They will never buy it. I mean, at that point, I'd been doing Lobster for, I don't know, 15, 20 years, and 1,000 people thought it was worth buying. That's all, 1,000. So I said to the guy, people used to think, I set up a radical magazine and forward with the revolution. This will forward the workers' struggle or whatever. And it isn't true. It won't happen. The public aren't interested. And even if they were, this stuff is very, very complicated. Even explaining a very small event in big detail is very complicated stuff. So you've got to accept that your peer group, people who are going to read you, is a very small group of people. And they're all going to be probably as weird as you are.
Me personally, I hope not. But anyway,
There's no point in saying I'm going to write a book about the Kennedy assassination, which will be read by millions of people. Because if you write it in anything resembling enough detail to make your case, it'll be too complex for people. They won't be interested in that level of detail. But you could write a book saying, Kennedy was shot by, there's one theory, Kennedy was shot by one of the guards in the limousine, stood up with his rifle and accidentally shot him in the head. And that made the Daily Mail, and it made a film, and it made a book, that sort of stuff. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, obviously, never a particularly good situation when oversimplification may make something interesting to the masses, as it were. But do you have any advice?
You used the masses, not me, Paul. You used it first.
Okay, no, the people, the public. I'm not, sort of trying to knock the public or anything. But let's say, how would you is there anything at all from your many years of writing that you would recommend just, to try and, because you write very interesting stuff. I really do think so. What would you say to people who want to present a sort of complex concept in the parapolitical realm? How would you recommend making it as interesting as is possible for them? Because it may be too difficult for a lot of people sometimes to read about these topics, no matter who's writing them. But what would you recommend to just try and hook the audience, as it were? Anything at all?
No, I literally have no idea. The only advice I would give anybody starting out in the modern world is be very careful about the sources that you trust, because there's an extraordinary number of totally unreliable sources out there. And the problem with the internet was, once upon a time, if you were a newspaper, it looked like a newspaper. If you were a little magazine produced in Hull, it looked like a little magazine produced in Hull. These days, internet websites, they all look the same. So here's a newspaper website and here's a nonsense website, and they look exactly the same. And coming to it, you couldn't tell. There are no clues about the status of the content from the way it looks. There are some totally nonsensical websites that look fantastic. That's the big problem, I think, nowadays. How do you distinguish how do you distinguish the shit from the shinola? And it's difficult these days. It is difficult. I've been doing it a long time, so I don't have a problem at all. I can tell within 10 seconds of looking at a website just by who they're quoting. Nonsense, could it be nonsense or not? I can still discriminate. But if I was 30, I'll bet I couldn't.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, no, it's such a wilderness of mirrors, to use a very, very
famous phrase.
Yeah, famous phrase. Angleton. Have you read about? Yeah, I presume you've read quite a bit about Angleton, written about him. Yeah,
I have. He's the man that told MI5 in the 1970s that the commies were running the Labour Party. It all came from him. And in those days, if you were in the MI5, some of MI5, if you were in the anti-communist wing of MI5, and Angleton told that, Angleton was God. He was the CIA. He had 50 times your budget. He had 1,000 times more sources. You didn't disbelieve Angleton. So Angleton says, Wilson's a commie being run by Moscow. You believed him. That's why they believed it.
Yeah, because he had quite a role in Italy during the whole sort of, parapolitical stuff that went on there. They mentioned, the Italian strategy of tension. Yep. And there's another quote from him. I can't remember the context. It was like, even a paranoiac has enemies, was what he said. So It
I
just
haven't
shows.
heard that one.
Yeah, yeah.
There's another good one about that, which I think I can't remember who coined this one. Is, yes, I'm paranoid, but am I paranoid enough? Which
Right.
would suit too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know. Yeah, it's because
I mean, Angleton destroyed a big chunk of the CIA. He paralyzed the CIA because he believed that there were Soviet moles, the KGB moles in the CIA, and he began this obsessive search for the moles. And the CIA basically ground to a halt, because he was burrowing here and burrowing there, and the whole thing just came to a stop because they couldn't work with Angleton. Eventually, they got rid of him, and things went back to normal. And were there any Soviet moles? Not really, not really.
wow, that's
One or two little ones, but forgive me. I suspect by the late 1970s, the intelligence agencies, the bright people in intelligence agencies, took the view: the more they know, the more we know about each other, the better. Since we've got nuclear fucking weapons, we don't want anything to go off by mistake, So now, of course, with the internet, everybody knows pretty much everything about everybody now, I suspect. I mean, we know a great deal. We could find out a great deal about China just rummaging around on the internet. Goodness knows what the CIA China desk has got, sources they've got, for example. They must know where every Chinese missile is stationed, I would guess, from their satellites.
yeah, yeah. Now, you'd actually something that I was going to bring up earlier, but I forgot. But this was very interesting as well. One of your readers, and back in the day, and probably still, was a man named Anthony Freeman. And for those unfamiliar, Anthony Freeman was a longtime assistant to the great Stanley Kubrick. Do you remember talking to Anthony Freeman back in the day and chatting with him and stuff?
He was one. We talked. Anthony Fruin, pronounced Fruin.
Fruin, yeah.
Anthony Fruin. He was one of my. He was one of the when I first produced Lobster. Some copies ended up in a thing called the Alternative Bookshop in London, which was a right-wing libertarian, a right-wing anarchist bookshop. And some copies ended up in there. I think they took 6 or a dozen. And Fruin bought one. And he discovered, as he said to me later, I thought I was the only person interested in this stuff. And there we were. And Fruin worked for Stanley Kubrick. And because he had an office and he had a free phone, and Fruin would ring me up and we would talk for hours. And we'd talk for hours probably every day for years. We'd have long, elaborate chats about what we were reading and all the rest of it. So Fruin was a very important part of all this in some ways. Yes, he was. And he's written occasionally, he wrote some stuff for Lobster. He's written the odd bits and pieces for Lobster. But now now he writes film scripts. He's a big cheese.
So what exactly was like, did you ever talk to Stanley Kubrick himself?
No, never met Kubrick. My big regret was that Fruin never introduced me to Kubrick.
Well, that's a pity, but yeah, I know what you mean. With Anthony Fruin, when was the last time does he still contribute to Lobster, or?
Occasionally, we talked. We had a chat last week. He's busy. I'm busy. We're getting old, getting slow. Yeah, we still chat, but not in the way we used to. No, not in the way we used to. But the way we used to, that was 40 years ago. We were in our 30s. As you get older, things get slower and more difficult. So no, he's not doing any serious research anymore, but he still reads everything. He's an amazing reader. He reads books. He reads things, and he's got a bit of money, I guess, and he can afford to. If he sees it, he just buys it. Oh, have that on Amazon, get it delivered, and all the rest of it. But yeah, he hasn't written anything for me for. I can't remember when he last wrote. A couple of years ago, I guess. He writes the odd book review.
Good, yeah, interesting. Yeah, no, that's really cool. Yeah, I mean, it's been so interesting talking to him. I mean, certainly in documentaries I've watched about Kubrick, Fruin's in quite a few of them. He seems like a really interesting guy. So
he is. He's a very interesting. He's a very nice guy. Yeah, Tony. He used to be Tony, and now he's Anthony. By the way.
Right. Yeah, that's
my middle name.
But anyway, my middle name, coincidentally. But anyway,
Tony.
Anthony, but it's an old little classical thing. But anyway, so like where do you go from here? Like, what particular topics would you like to explore more in the future for Lobster? Any in particular that you really are eager to write about? I mean, you've written a lot already, but anything else?
Well, the range of things that Lobster's covered is vast. Now, the range of things that I've covered is pretty big, and none of it's being resolved. None of the big stories have been settled. I mean, for example, I wrote quite a lot in the 90s, I wrote quite a lot about mind control, because I met an American guy came to see me and told me this story. A man called Harlan Gerard. He's now dead. He rang me up and said, "Can I come and see you?" I said, "Yeah, sure, come to Hull." And Harlan Gerard, he was a middle class, prosperous American, white American. He'd been going around the media in London, trying to get them to take an interest in the CIA and mind control. He claimed he was a CIA mind control victim. And they all kept saying, no, 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 go and see them, go and see that. And eventually somebody said no. And it spirals down. And right at the bottom of the pile, the media pile, is Lobster. Why don't you ring Lobster? So he rings Lobster. I say, well, yeah, come to Hull. That was always my thing. Come to Hull. It put most people off. But he did. He turned up with two very expensive leather suitcases in his hands, in shreds, carrying the bloody things. And they were full of photocopies about microwaves and what microwaves might do, and mind control experiments and all the rest of it. And, and he told me this story about, the CIA were monitoring him and talking to him. He had somebody in his ear all day long telling him what to say, what to think. And I said, are they doing it now? Yes, they are. So I thought, well, this is probably crazy. On the other hand, I'd read just enough about the CIA to know they had been interested in mind control in the 60s. They'd been doing experiments in the 50s and 60s. So I said, well, I don't know how, and I don't know what to say. And he anyway left me a copy of all these. I've got a file drawer there, a whole file drawer of documents on mind control, on microwaves, none of which which ultimately I have totally unresolved. I still don't know whether he was telling me the truth. And there were other people in Britain said the same thing. I once had a meeting with 4 of them. These are intelligent, middle-aged, 1 American, 3 Brits. And I said to them, how many of you are being beamed at now? And 2 of them put their hands up. And these were all, if you'd met them, you would say rational, sensible people. They all claimed that they were being beamed at by people in the CIA talking to them. So what do you do with that? I've tried to make sense of it. Other people have written about it. So, for example, that subject isn't clear at all. But I never resolved it. It's impossible to resolve. I simply don't know. Would the CIA try and do this? Of course they would. Somebody famously said, if you can imagine it, it's been tried already.
That's often true, but, again, about some things, who knows? Who knows? It's just,
Well, put it this way, these large agencies employing thousands of people on high salaries whose job it is to think about, how can we do this? How can we do that? What can we do next? If I, Joe Blow on the street, can imagine it, they've tried it already. So do I think the CIA have tried microwave experiments? Probably. Do I know that Harlan Gerard was being beamed at by the CIA when he was in my room in Hull? I have no idea. How, technically, even if that was physically possible, how would they do it? Using a satellite? I don't know. I have no idea. No idea.
Well, yeah. I mean,
but you began by saying, what would I do? The point is, all of these things, I may come across something on the internet which bumps me off into mind control again. I haven't done anything on mind control for a long time because I'm no longer looking at it. I'm chiefly interested in, at the moment, personally, chiefly interested in the economic crash that's going to happen and knock Britain down, flatten it. Well, Britain is now about 25th. We're about the 25th richest country in the world. People keep saying, oh, we're the 5th richest. No, we aren't. We're 25th, Britain. And it's getting worse. We're getting poorer. The poor in Britain are now desperately poor. And there's a quarter of the British population who are living below the official poverty level. Nobody talks about this. It's politically embarrassing. And nobody knows what to do about it. Thanks to Mrs. Thatcher and Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, they knocked out a third of British manufacturing. British manufacturing base was just ignored for 40 years virtually. So we're in the shit economically, and it's only going to get worse. That strikes me as the most important thing I can do at the moment. That's what interests me most. And I'm reading about the Kennedy assassination on the side. Chiefly, I'm trying to think about ways, what on earth one can do about the coming crisis. And it might be happening. I mean, there's a big problem coming with derivatives again. Derivatives is a huge derivatives mountain that could crash any second. We could have 2008 again. Could be any minute now. If you believe what you read on the internet, it's going to be any minute now. And the whole problem, all those problems about democracies and financial forces and big corporations, how do you control them? Nobody knows. Nobody's tried.
I certainly would not know. That's I mean, you would know more than me though. I mean, seriously, like it's just such a complex topic, finance,
But
you know, high finance.
that's why there's economics in Lobster, which it didn't used to be. I began writing this economic stuff in the late 80s. I began because it's not really Lobster's subject. But then Lobster's basically just me and a few people that write and edit and do editing and things. So fuck it, whatever I'm interested in is what's going in Lobster. And that's it. There's quite a lot of economic stuff being in recently. Well, political economy, not really economics, but the politics of economics. We're going to get a government, Labour government's going to have them arrive in next year. And we've got Keir Starmer, who knows nothing about economics, and Rachel Reeves, who was trained by the Bank of England. How good's that going to be?
Well, on that,
how orthodox is that going to be?
was that?
I said, how orthodox is that going to be? A Bank of England trained economist is going to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Well, on that,
if you were poor, if you were living on an estate in Holland, you were living on family. What's it called? What's it called? Income support. If you were living, I wouldn't get your hopes up.
I know what you mean. Yeah, I know what you mean. It's sad, but you know, I think it's just, you know, good that you're interested in writing about economics and, you know, things that I would never be able to understand particularly well, and many other people as well. So you know, it's on that.
It's not that. Not honest to God, it's not that difficult. It's presented very difficultly. That's very difficult, but it's terribly simple, really. Oh, gee, interest rates are going up. Who's going to benefit from that? The people that lend you money are going to benefit from that. It starts there. Why are interest rates going up? Oh, well, it's to control inflation. Yeah, but it also makes the people that lend you money rich. And that's the danger. And so tiptoeing down this narrow line, trying to stay rational while dealing with all this extremely emotive stuff is one of the tricks.
Oh yeah, no, that's and that is a good tip about, you know, just for aspiring writers, aspiring journalists, you know, just keeping the balance right, like between.
There are hardly any journalists left. Nobody would be advised to go and do journalism training because there's hardly any journalists left. They're mostly working in PR these days. But the great thing about the internet is if you just want to write, you can. Getting published isn't difficult. You can, for Christ's sake, you can start your own website if you have to. I mean, when I was starting in the late middle late 1970s, getting published was very, very difficult. You know, there were very few outlets who would touch you, and you know, they were either big newspapers who wouldn't touch you because you weren't on their staff and they took hardly any freelancers, or they were lefty magazines who had lines you had to follow. You know, I think the Socialist Workers' Party had a paper then. I think was it called Workers' Press? No, that was a WRP. There were little lefty magazines, but you could only write for them in a particular way. So it was very difficult to write. Very difficult to get published. These days, getting published is easy. You can publish yourself on the internet, nothing to it. Write your own book. Amazon will publish a quite a decent looking book if you've got the money. And some of those Amazon books, I've got a couple up there I can see from here. They're quite good books, you know. But the internet's changed.
Yeah, it's interesting, the democratization of writing, of, you know, the open.
In a sense, yes.
Yeah, it's interesting. Absolutely. Well, where can people find you? So Lobster Magazine, what's the best way?
Just Google Lobster Magazine, you'll find it.
Lobster Magazine, and you're on Twitter, or X as it's now called.
I'm not on Twitter, but one of my colleagues is on Twitter. Garrick Alder, he writes on Twitter. I don't even read Twitter.
Yeah, it's become a bit of a
weapons of mass distraction again. I really can't be bothered with it.
Yeah. No, I would not disagree. Well, thank you, sir, for joining me. I really appreciate it. It's been interesting. Really interesting stuff.
I'm glad you found it interesting. I've got no idea how it will appear to people I really don't know. But
well, that's the fun of it. That's the fun of it, you know.
Never mind the nonsense that I'm talking. Look at the stuff that's been published by Lobster. There's a lot of good stuff up there. Lobster Magazine.
Cool, brilliant. Well, thanks very much, sir, and have a great day.
You too. Nice to meet you. Cheers.